Joining us now, he is the new chairman of a very important committee. Well, when it convenes in January, when the new Congress convenes, the Democrats in the majority. My congressman, Democrat Bobby Scott, 3rd District, Virginia. Congressman, great to have you, man.
John, good to be on the show again.
I know. It's always so much fun, and we try to get John every week. Sometimes we can't get schedules worked out. But, all right, tell our audience about, in the new majority, you're going to be chairman of a very important committee. Just give us an overview on that.
Well, we haven't technically had the votes yet, but there's no I don't have any apparent opposition, so I expect to be the chair of the Education and Labor Committee. It's a committee with great jurisdiction, all of education, from early childhood, K through 12, higher education, including job training programs, all of the labor issues, the mechanics and joining a labor union, whether that's going to be easier or harder, OSHA, workplace safety, mine safety, things like that, overtime pay issues like overtime and minimum wage before the committee. It also has Child Nutrition and Older Americans Act, which will be coming up, juvenile justice. It has a great jurisdiction, a lot of civil rights laws involving employment. So I'm looking forward to a lot of work.
Okay, so let's get right to it, Congressman, and start with what is going to be your committee, Education and Labor Committee. And I want to start with something. You put a press release out the other day, and it really caught my eye because I've been familiar with this industry for so long. You want to take a hard look at for-profit colleges, and I know there's a lot of abuse that goes on. You know, back in the day when you had the Pell Grant back in the day, you had all of these profit-making colleges pop up. A lot of them scammed Pell Grants and GSLs. Then the Reagan administration stepped in, fixed that a little bit. What is your vision now with all of these for-profit colleges popped up? What is your vision to be sure that they're on the up and up?
Well, that's the problem. It's not all of them. It is in fact a lot of them advertise, recruit people in, and don't give them any meaningful benefit. There's some good ones and some bad ones, and our challenge is to kind of separate the good from the bad. One of the things we rely on are the accrediting agencies that accredit them as bona fide educational. All of the colleges have to be accredited, whether they're for-profit or not, and there are different agencies that do this. One of those, ACICS, has been notorious in giving accreditation to schools that just have big problems. I mean, right to the day before they closed last year, Corinthian, ITT, ACIS had given them accreditation, and recently about 20,000 students are going to be victims of a school closing just last week. The idea of the accreditation is that federal financial aid only goes to accredited schools. So if you can't get accreditation, students can't take advantage of Pell Grants, they can't take advantage of federal student loans. What happens essentially is when they lose their accreditation, they can't participate in the student loan and Pell Grant program because that's where they were getting all of their money. The schools close. ACIS has been very weak on their accreditation. In fact, the ACP schools that closed last week had been looking to be accredited by another agency. About a couple of years ago, ACIS, right after the Corinthian and ITT debacle, lost their recognition as an accreditor. A few weeks ago, the Education Department put them back on the list of accreditors, and that was the press release. You said, I said, what in the world are they doing back in? They don't have any record. The other accreditors don't think much of them, and they have a history of accrediting people that shouldn't be accredited. We had a grace period after they're taken out. So some of these people only had that. Many of the schools got accreditation with other agencies, so they're in good shape. but the ACP schools did not. In fact, they had tried to get accredited by another agency, and they refused. Surprise! They ended up closing. So one of the things that we're going to be looking into is how are we going to separate the good and the bad for-profit schools. One is to make sure that the accrediting agencies are doing their jobs. And here we have one that is notorious and not doing its job back on the list. So we'll have an opportunity to, and there were some irregularities about the process of getting them back on the list. And we'll, when the committee convenes, we'll get some answers about what happened. I mean, there's a lot of money that goes to these for-profit organizations.
Right.
There's nothing inherently wrong with them, but many of them tend to advertise, promise things, and not fulfill those promises, and students are just being ripped off along with the federal taxpayer.
This has been going on a long time, and I'm sure you're going to make the effort to get to the bottom of it because, look, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of these colleges are very, very successful and very helpful to many students, many of them online, et cetera. But, it's bad apples here that ruin the whole thing. So I'm sure you're on that.
Separating the good from the bad has been a difficult thing to do because in a lot of areas, I just tell you, there are no good for-profit schools. They're all bad. In other areas, in this area, we have some good and some that are problematic. But we want to we don't want to get rid of the good ones. We want to draw a fine line. And what many of them, when they look around and don't see any good ones, they just said any measure that puts all of them out of business must be a good measure, and that really doesn't work. So we're going to be working to make sure that the good ones can survive and the bad ones go out of business.
We're with Democratic Congressman Bobby Scott from the 3rd District of Virginia. He's now going into the majority. Nancy Pelosi is going to be the speaker. By the way, Bobby Scott told me she was going to be the speaker months ago, and he said that all the jumping up and down of the Abigail Spanbergers of the world say she's not going to vote for her. Meantime, Abigail took $500,000 from Pelosi's committee, so the whole thing's nonsense. It's just swampy stuff. Let's get to prison reform, Congressman. This is an issue that you and I really, really have been in lockstep on since the day we met in your office back in, I think it was 2009 or 10. And I think that the prison reform bill that Jared Kushner crafted, that the president's backing, it's a great start. But one of the things that they've not addressed, and I want your take on it, is when is there going to be an opportunity for us to get rid of the bail system of cash, which is discriminatory to people without any money? I mean, that's not in this bill. When do we get that done?
Well, that idea that you pre-trial, before the trial, there's a presumption of innocence, and you offer what is cash bail. If you can come up with some money, you can get out before trial. There are a lot of people, including you and me, that believe that the pre-trial release ought to be based on risk, not wealth.
Right.
If you've got money, you're out. If you don't have any money, you're in. And there are studies that show that a shockingly high portion of Americans would have trouble coming up with a surprise bill of $500. And that's about what the bail is, a couple of $100, maybe a couple of thousand. If you've got it, you can get out, and if you don't have it, you're stuck. For those that, if you're stuck in jail pre-trial for several weeks, sometimes several months, the likelihood of you keeping your job and keeping your housing are remote, because you're going to be several months behind on your rent. And what kind of employer is going to say, "Well, I'll hold your job for you while you're in jail"? So you come out homeless and unemployed. If you have money, you keep your house and keep your job. A lot of these penalties, once you're found guilty, a lot of the penalties are suspended jail time, where the penalty isn't any jail time. And they're used to spend all that time and suffered all the consequences of being in jail for a couple of months. and that's just not fair. It has nothing to do with public safety, because the assessment wasn't based on the holding in jail wasn't based on risk.
Yes.
Because if you'd had the money, you'd have been out.
And
so having a system of a risk assessment rather than wealth assessment just seems fair.
Well, it's also harmful, and there's the fairness issue, and then there's the harm issue. And just let me take 30 seconds and give an example. You know, you get arrested for something, you don't have any money. If you had the money or you had the credit card, you could post the bail. So you don't have the money. Maybe you have an old car. Maybe you have a job. You're living, week to week, or if you're a day laborer, you're living day to day. So you can't post bail, so you can't show up for work, so you can't get paid, so you get fired from your job, so you lose your car because you can't make the payment, so you lose your apartment because you can't pay your rent. Now you get out in 30 days, you have no job, you have no car, and you have nowhere to live, and now you're homeless. Now tell me how the hell that makes it all.
Well, it doesn't, and it's unfair, and it's all wealth-based. It didn't have anything to do with public safety, because if they'd had the money, they'd have been out. So if there were risks to society, the cash bail is no barrier to. It doesn't help on the risk assessment, and it's just not fair. And so you come up, no car, no house, no job, and you talk about the public safety aspects. Who is most at risk for committing a crime? Is somebody that just lost a house, car, and job, and now has to find some money to eat. It just makes no sense. And there's a lot of support for changing. It's been around for as far back as anybody can remember, and it's just a bad policy, particularly when you sit up here and sometimes you don't get a trial date for several weeks. You talked about a month. Completing a trial within a month is unusual. You got a preliminary hearing, then you got several more weeks after that. It could be 2 or 3 or 4 months before you actually complete a trial. And
many of these people just get exonerated; they just get released.
Yeah, and that's
the prosecutor drops
if you're found innocent, you've suffered all of that when you were innocent to begin with. If you were guilty, you probably would have pleaded guilty and could have gotten right back out.
Makes no sense. I mean, the whole thing
on a suspended sentence. That happens a lot, where they go into the jail and say, if you plead guilty, you can walk out on a suspended sentence, and say, well, I'm not guilty. Well, that's a pretty bad box for somebody to be in. You're going to lose your job, car, and house if you maintain your innocence and you're found innocent, but you've suffered all the consequences when you could have pleaded guilty and walked out. Of course, you have a record for the rest of your life, and that's a pressure that I think is just unfair to impose on people, and you can get rid of it. If there are no risks to society, let them out pending trial, and then you have the trial in due course. And it's no different in terms of public safety. If they had been able to borrow the money, and if they're a gang member, the gang leader would have gotten them the bail, and they'd have been out. So, I mean, you're not protecting yourself from anything.
And a lot of our listeners are saying, well, why hasn't this been done? So if you walk the halls of Congress, what you're going to find is the bail bondsman lobbyist machine, where you've got lobbyists running around in $8,000 Armani Italian suits lobbying congressmen, throwing money at them in order to preserve this corrupt system, because the people that make out is the cash bail bondsmen that are getting 10 or 15% of everything they do, along with, by the way, the other lobbyist for the private profit-making prisons that are on the stock exchange. I mean, the criminal justice system in this country, I mean, if you were to go to someone that didn't understand how this works and explain it to them, they would think you were lying to them. Like, this can't possibly be that way. Tell me about what's in the Trump prison reform bill that you like, and are you inclined to vote in favor of it as a start?
You mentioned the bail bondsmen and the for-profit prisons. Another barrier to common sense is just simple-minded politics. The slogans and sound bites that people come up with, tough on crime,
lock them up,
that just make for ridiculous policy. And then the idea that, and this was you get this frequently on the issue of parole. If somebody who could not have made cash bail gets out and commits a crime, You say, well, if we hadn't let him out and he didn't have any money, he would have stayed in. Therefore, the whole policy is bad. You can't, although it's a good policy, it's not going to be a perfect policy. People who get out on bail commit crimes. I would suspect there's going to be a lower rate than ever because they're about to go to trial. They don't want to have multiple charges. But the people are scared of the anecdote rather than the overall policy. In the bill that's pending in the Senate, you have what's called prison reform, where you essentially have more services provided for prisoners so that they're less likely to come out. It's a little more complicated than it needs to be, but I think it's a step in the right direction. They added sentencing reform to the bill, and it has a lot of good provisions, but there's some provisions that are a little problematic. One is one of the problems in the criminal justice system is mandatory minimums, where the judge has no discretion but to impose an absurd sentence. They reduce some of the mandatory minimums, but then at the same time greatly expand the number of people who are subject to the mandatory minimum. So we haven't had a formal assessment of it, but my sense is that you'll have at least 10, 20, maybe 50 times more people in jail under mandatory minimums under that provision than the present penalty that's bad enough on its face. There are other good provisions in it, and on balance, we'll just have to see how it works out. But one of the things that I've found is people just seem offended if you have a regular process where you have hearings and do research and evidence and base legislation on evidence and research. They just seem offended if you try to do something intelligent. They say, "Well, you're against the bill. You're trying to kill the bill." If you want a hearing, if you want to hear from researchers and people who are experts to see what the effect would be, then you're against the bill. It's inertia and politics have just taken over crime policy, and that's the way it's been for many years.
Well, Congressman, that's why I'm going to ask you this next question. If the bill was on the docket today, would you vote for it or not?
I'm still researching it to find out the best I can what the impact is. They've got many very good policies on the prison side. When it's just the prison side, I did vote for it. I'd hoped they'd improve it a little bit, but apparently they haven't. There are a lot of good provisions on the sentencing side, but there are some other provisions that just don't make any sense. So we're still trying to figure that out, particularly on the question of whether more people or fewer people will be caught up in mandatory minimums as a result of the legislation. When you look at it, one thing you want to look at is what effect it has generally on mass incarceration and how it fights the war on drugs. Are you fighting the war on drugs with as the Nixon administration, all criminal justice, or the way we're fighting it with opioids, with services, health as a healthcare problem, as a public health problem? Public health is a much more intelligent way to do it. Actually works. The war on drugs, all that does is just builds up your prisons and doesn't reduce drug use, doesn't reduce crime. And when you look at it from a research-based perspective, sometimes some of the provisions in crime bills just don't make any sense. And so I'm evaluating it. I don't know just yet, but it does have some very good provisions, and although it has some bad provisions, we'll see how the balance works out. It probably works out balance more good than bad, but you wonder why the bad provisions were in there.
Okay, so eventually in the House there's going to be a vote on whether or not we stay in or get out of the Yemeni civil war. Are you voting for us to get out?
I'm still thinking about it. I'm probably going to vote to get out.
All right, I'm out of time. Bobby Scott saying let's get out of Yemen. And it looks like you're on the fence on the prison reform bill, but leaning towards trying to fix it so you can vote for it.